In this video, we're going to take a look at overclocking, mainly chasing that 5.0 gigahertz metric. It's something I've been guilty of ever since I got this computer. The idea of overclocking was something that I was kind of enamored with. I saw other people doing it. I saw the LN2 overclocking videos and seeing that stuff, it's exciting. And the idea of being able to push your hardware to the bleeding edge, it's something I always wanted to try and kind of dip my hands into. So one of the things that I did though, is I spent way too much time overclocking and tweaking and dialing, and I never really understood the benefits of what the final outcome was going to be. What were the gains truly going to be while gaming? I know I could hit the number, so I've got an i90-900KF, 4.7 gigahertz standard. And I was like, oh, I'm going to go to 5.0. I got my 2080 Ti OC. I'm going to overclock that. I've got my 3600 Corsair Vengeance RAM. I'm good to go. Well, the reality is it wasn't that simple. And at the end of the day, I learned a lot, but I never really put what I learned to the test. I always had theories about what was worthwhile and what wasn't. And I never really understood what the actual benefits would be until I basically tried it all. And that's what I did in this video. In a massive effort to save everyone else a lot of heartache and grief, I spent 12 hours over several days. Actually, I think it's been about a week and a half now that I've been kind of trying to find time to do these benchmarks. I ran benchmarks in 10 different applications. Now, 5 of those applications were true benchmark applications. And then I did 5 games that actually have built-in benchmarks. The benchmarks included Cinebench R15, Cinebench R20, Time Spy, Port Royal, and Heaven. Now, the games were Division 2, Borderlands 3, Horizon Zero Dawn, Assassin's Creed Odyssey, and Shadow of the Tomb Raider. I figured those provided a varied width across what is going to perform better. Because really at the end of the day, what I wanted to see was, is a CPU overclock going to make the biggest impact in gaming? Is the GPU overclock going to do it? How much influence does actually turning on XMP? And for those of you that don't know what XMP is, that is actually setting your RAM to run at the speed that it was designed to run at. When you go out and buy that 3600 speed RAM or 3200 speed RAM and you plug it in and you say, okay, great, I'm good to go. No, you're not. It's still running at its default speed, which is roughly 2100 megahertz. You actually have to go into the BIOS and turn on XMP, which is a profile that tells your computer to run your RAM at the speed that it was rated to run at. So a lot of people, I know a lot of people know this, but there's many that don't. And a lot of people just plug it in, and I take it for granted sometimes in random conversations on our Twitch streams that people are like, oh yeah, so I've got this speed RAM. And I'm like, oh, do you enable your XMP? And they're like, what's that? And they didn't realize that they weren't running their RAM at the rated speed. So if you don't know about XMP, go ahead, look it up, load into your BIOS, enable it. Thank me later. Now, all tests were done on my computer, which, as I stated before, is an i90-900KF. I have a Strix 2080 Ti OC and 32 gigs of Corsair Vengeance Pro RAM running at 3600 megahertz. Now, I'll have the full description for my PC specs in the description down below. It is also water cooled. In the process of overclocking, when I first got my computer, I had an AIO and I was running on air for my GPU, and I was getting thermal throttled. And as some of you know, I do stream on a single PC while gaming, so I wanted to be able to maximize all of it. So I was like, I'm going to overclock everything. So I went to liquid cooling. It definitely has its benefits. I'll talk about that in a separate video of what was worth it, where I saw the biggest gains. But in this video, just know that across the board, all of the settings were identical for all the games. I didn't change any settings. All of the CPU overclocks were based off of my most stable settings running at 5.0. The same goes for my GPU. I'll include the full overclocking specs for both the CPU and the GPU in the description as well. Now, as far as the tests that were run, I first established a baseline with 4.7 gigahertz and with no XMP and no GPU overclock. That is basically out of the box stock. Here's how I got it. What do I get? Right? That's what we started with. And I compared everything to that. From there, we ran 7 other tests. The first test was 4.7 gigahertz turning XMP on, letting the RAM run at 3600 megahertz. The next test was 4.7 gigahertz, no XMP, but with the GPU overclocked. Now the overclock on the GPU was plus 100 on the core and plus 1000 on the memory. I'll have the full specs in the description. Then next at 4.7, I did both XMP and GPU. Then we moved to 5 gigahertz. So then I did 5 gigahertz, no XMP, no GPU overclock, 5 gigahertz with XMP, 5 gigahertz with a GPU overclock, and then finally 5 gigahertz with XMP and a GPU overclock. So that covered all of the bases. And what I wanted to do was see what was the baseline of each individual overclock, the XMP versus the CPU versus the GPU, compared against the baseline individually. And then I wanted to see, do any combination of the two help influence one another? Does overclocking the CPU greatly help the GPU? Does XMP help either? And at the end of the day, I put it all together for basically what I thought was maximum performance and tried to see, okay, is that going to win out in all cases? And overall, the results were pretty surprising. So we've got a lot to cover. But first, if you're not following me on Twitch, feel free to swing by every Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, starting at 9:30 p.m. Pacific time, where I'm streaming random games and talking about technology and streaming tips and basically anything you guys have questions about. So feel free to stop by and check in there. And you can do so at the link down below. Now let's go ahead and jump right into this. So first, let's talk about what our baseline is. Our CPU is clocking in at 4.7 gigahertz on all cores. Our memory is at 2142 megahertz with 0 offsets on the GPU. Now with the XMP overclock, we can hit 3600 megahertz on the RAM, and we can go to 5.0 gigahertz on the CPU, stable. Now the baseline uplift on the CPU going from 4.7 to 5.0 gigs is roughly about a little over 6%. Right, so that's what we're expecting to see in a lot of these benchmarks. The real question is, how does that translate to games and FPS? So first, we're going to take a look at Cinebench R15. And as expected, based off of the way this benchmark works, the overall uplift only came in when we went to 5 gigahertz. Any of the tests with XMP, the GPU overclock, XMP and GPU, we really didn't see much of anything. I mean, it was less than 1%, which is pretty negligible. It's within margin of error. Now, the second we went to 5 gigs, we saw a 5.28 increase in performance from stock. So right there, we're almost at the expected 6%. Now, adding 5.0 and XMP, we actually hit a 7%. That was actually our highest number, getting a Cinebench score of 2033. Adding the GPU overclock came in a little bit lower. That might just be margin of error. We only ended up with a 6.35% uplift for a score of 20.19. Now, the difference between first and second place was 14 points. It's less than a percentage. We're talking 0.75%. That's probably just margin of error. But again, both of those were 5.0 gigahertz runs. The GPU, as expected in a test like this, had no bearing. So if you're just going for scores and benchmark numbers and just trying to hit those high numbers, obviously overclocking your CPU is going to be the way to go. And we're going to see that across the rest of the tests here. Going from 4.7 to 5.0 with XMP actually gave us an overall uplift of 7%. We increased our score 134 points. Now, that being said, I also measured the maximum CPU temperature. Now, from base, going to 5.0 gigahertz actually increased our temperatures by 25%, we went from a max temperature of 71 degrees up to a max temperature of 90 degrees on this test. And again, that's on liquid cooling. So for those of you that don't understand how overclocking works, essentially more voltage and more power equals higher frequencies and higher speeds. So as you push more voltage and more power through the devices, they generate more heat. So that's the trade-off, right? You're trying to balance heat versus speed and stability. So this is something that we want to keep in mind as we're overclocking. You don't want to constantly push higher and higher and higher temps. Eventually, you're going to thermal throttle yourself. But again, that's why you move on to things like liquid cooling, that it's going to help keep those average temperatures down. So while we are seeing performance gains here, I'm trying to keep in mind, is it worth the temperature uplift? So in this case, obviously, if I'm just going for a benchmark score, yes, I may want to just do a single run of this, try and push everything as hard as possible, and then back off for daily use. All right, now let's look at Cinebench R20, which uses AVX instructions. And I did have an AVX offset of 0. So everything, when I did run at 4.7 and 5.0, that was across all cores for both 4.7 and 5.0. So our highest scores, again, as expected, were basically when we went to the 5.0 gigahertz overclock, and everything on 5 gigahertz was all within the same range. Now our highest score was when I had the CPU, GPU, and the XMP enabled. And these are the averages of 3 runs. So these numbers are fairly consistent across the board. So at the end of the day, with our CPU, XMP, and GPU, we saw a 6.27% increase in our score, adding 292 points for a final score of 4950 in Cinebench R15. Again, that is an increase of 28.7% in heat. It's a lot. We actually got up to 96 Celsius at one point. Wouldn't recommend it. Would not recommend it. Okay, Time Spy was where things start to actually get interesting, because Time Spy both takes into account your GPU as well as your CPU, and your end score is weighted as a combined total. So our best score still was using XMP, a GPU overclock, and a 5 gigahertz overclock. However, a 4.7 baseline on the CPU with XMP and a GPU overclock put us within 1% of having the CPU overclocked. Our final score difference was 189 points. Now, while our best score was having everything overclocked, the CPU, the GPU, and having XMP enabled, we were within 1% when I was still at 4.7 gigahertz and only using XMP and GPU. The increase in temperature there was only 3.29% when staying at 4.7 gigahertz, but going to 5.0, again, a 25% increase in temperatures. So our maximum uplift was 11% over our base with a final score of 15,473. However, our Time Spy score at 4.7 was 15,284. For an uplift of 9.77%. That's only a 1% difference. In this case, you are going for the highest number, so you would probably boost your overclock as much as possible because you are trying to hit a target in a benchmark. That being said, we're going to look at a couple more benchmarks, but then we're going to see how this translates to games. All right, so next I ran Port Royal. And for those that don't know, Port Royal is essentially 100% GPU-based benchmark. There should be no influence on the CPU, and I wanted to just test that to make sure, and I also wanted to see if XMP had any real bearing. The end result was that my 4.7 CPU with XMP on and my GPU overclock actually gave me the best score of 10,169. That's a 9.89% increase over our base score. And in that case, we only had a GPU temperature uplift of 7%, hitting a max of 45 degrees Celsius. So that's pretty negligible. As expected, our 5 gigahertz score, when there was not a GPU overclock, we're very close to our base score. In fact, I actually had a score that was lower than my 4.7 base. So you can see in this case, there was no impact by overclocking the CPU as expected. One of the things I wanted to see was if XMP would actually have any bearing on this test. I don't think so. We're within less than 1%. So I would just say that's within margin of error. Okay, next up was the Heaven benchmark. And this one was actually really interesting. Our highest number did come in with the 5.0 gigahertz on the CPU, the GPU overclocked with XMP. However, our overall score there was 3,321 with an average FPS of 131.9. Now, our second place score was 4.7 on the CPU, no XMP, and an overclock on the GPU, giving us a score of 3,317, still hitting 131 frames per second. Now, the percent increase from our base score was 9.16%, but the difference between first and second place was 0.1%. You know, in this case, between first and second place, there was less than a frame difference. It was 0.2 frames difference, right? So we're effectively hitting 131 frames no matter what. And for an overall increase of 11 frames per second from our base score. So it appears that the 5.0 gigahertz didn't necessarily seem to add anything to the score. And again, on our top score, we actually had an increase of temperatures on our CPU of 30% from our baseline. Our average max CPU temperature on our baseline was 61 degrees Celsius. And on our 5 gigahertz run, we were hitting close to 80 degrees Celsius. So we're seeing a pretty consistent, roughly 25% increase in temperatures across the board going to 5 gigahertz. All right, that's enough of the benchmarks. Let's look at the games and see where the FPS really matters. Okay, Division's an interesting one because Division doesn't really seem to respond to a CPU overclock. For the most part, unless we were doing a GPU overclock, we were hitting around 111 frames per second on the Division benchmark. The second we enabled our GPU overclock, we jumped up to an average of 121 frames. That was an instant 10 frame increase with an average uplift of 9.6%, which is fantastic just for a GPU overclock. Now our top score did come in with 5 gigs on the chip, the GPU overclock, and the XMP turned on. But our 4.7 CPU with XMP and the GPU overclock was literally running at the same frame rate. I mean, it was 0.3 off in the test. So in reality, we came in at 121 frames in both instances. Our temperature difference between the first and second run on the CPU was actually 18% higher on the 5 gigahertz and a total of 23% higher from our baseline. So we're seeing consistent temperature increases, but I'd take the 5% temperature increase any day over the 23% temperature increase. Okay, in Borderlands, we see a similar story. Our 5 gigahertz overclock on our CPU, the GPU overclock, and XMP scored the highest. We actually hit 115 frames per second on the Borderlands benchmark as compared to our second place, which was 4.7 on the chip, XMP on with the GPU overclock, which came in at 113 frames per second. So again, we're within 1.5 frames. I mean, it's pretty negligible at that point. Our overall uplift from our base score was up 13 frames per second, which is roughly a 12% increase, which is pretty fantastic. Now, Borderlands actually displayed one of the highest temperature differences from the base run. The base run came in at 67 degrees Celsius on the CPU, and running at 5 gigahertz with both the GPU and XMP turned on, I actually hit 89 degrees Celsius in the Borderlands benchmark. So that's getting pretty toasty. I wouldn't want to actually game at those temperatures. Next, we take a look at Horizon Zero Dawn. And this one actually flipped the script a little bit because in this case, 5.0 did not win. Granted, this was all very close, but 4.7 gigahertz XMP on with the GPU overclock actually took the win with a Horizon Zero Dawn benchmark score of 23,068.33 with an average FPS of 128 frames per second. Now, the 5 gigahertz run with the GPU overclock and XMP actually came in at 23,019. So it was a pretty small margin there. And we did hit 127 frames per second. So that's a 1 frame per second nod to the 4.7 gigahertz XMP on GPU overclock as compared to the 5 gigahertz version, which is an overall 10.5 frames per second increase over our base, which is roughly a 9% increase in performance. Now, again, we're seeing similar temperature increases where the 4.7 gigahertz with the GPU overclock and XMP was up 6% from the base. Running at 5 gigahertz actually increased up to 22% over our base. So still running hot. Moving on to Assassin's Creed Odyssey, our winner again, 5.0 gigahertz, our GPU overclock, as well as XMP on. So that actually got us a target frame rate of 85 frames per second with an overall uplift of 11.84%. Now, second place, you guessed it, 4.7 gigahertz XMP on with our GPU overclock, coming in at 83 frames per second for an overall uplift from base of 9.21%. So the difference between our first and second place scores was only 2 frames per second, really a 2% difference. So obviously something in Assassin's Creed is responding better to the 5.0 gigahertz overclock, but as expected, any score that had our GPU overclock on did outscore any other test that had the GPU overclock off. Now our final test is Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and this one has a bit of a split score. Our actual total number of rendered frames came in higher on the 4.7 gigahertz XMP on GPU overclock with 20,516 frames. However, the average FPS there across 3 runs came in at 130.67. Now I will say 2 of those runs came in at 131 frames per second. 1 run came in at 130 frames per second. Our second total number of frames rendered was the 5.0 gigahertz GPU overclocked with XMP, coming in at 20,480 frames. However, it did consistently hold 131 frames. I mean, we're talking a difference of 0.33 frames at that point. As a whole, both of these tests roughly 17 frames per second faster than the baseline, with an average uplift of about 15%, which is great. Now, again, we got to look at temperatures. The 4.7 CPU with XMP and the GPU overclock was running about 5.5% hotter than our baseline. However, the 5 gigahertz run was 35% hotter, hitting a max temperature of 88 degrees Celsius. Again, you got to look at these temperatures when you're looking at these numbers, because the reality is you don't want to be operating plus 85 degrees Celsius while gaming. I mean, we can get into the issues of longevity of your hardware and what you're actually going to do. And again, this is different. If you're just trying to hit a baseline number, or if you're just trying to hit a benchmark number and post a score, that's one thing. But for 24/7 operation, when you're gaming, running at these high temperatures, it's not good. You don't want to do it. I think when looking at these results, the first thing we need to ask ourselves is overclocking worth it? And I think the answer is yes. I mean, we're getting an average of 11% increase in performance across all of the games, and roughly 8% performance increase when benchmarking. But again, benchmarking is very targeted. So I think from this point on, while the benchmarks were interesting, I think we're mostly just going to focus on the results of the games. So looking at our top 2 scores, essentially across the board, in any case, it was either 4.7 gigahertz XMP on GPU overclock or the 5.0 gigahertz GPU overclock XMP on. And I think regardless, I think the GPU makes the biggest impact, and you can easily see that. We're talking about an average FPS increase of 10.75% on the 4.7 overclock and 11.5% on the 5.0 overclock. Now, if we actually look at the breakdown here, we can see our frames per second increase from base performance. It ranges anywhere from 9 frames per second in Assassin's Creed Odyssey, all the way up to 17 frames per second in Shadow of the Tomb Raider. Those are massive gains. There's no reason not to take advantage of this if you have the cooling to do it. When we talk about cooling, we're really concerned with temperatures, right? Now, here's the kicker. Now, the difference between our first place score, which in most cases was the 5.0 gigahertz overclock, was anywhere between a max of 2 frames to as little as a third of a frame. So in all reality, you're not going to see a difference in actual performance. But where you are going to see the difference is in the temperature shift. Now, the temperature delta between our 4.7 overclock CPU and our 5.0 overclock CPU was anywhere from as little as 16% all the way up to 30% increase between first and second place. That's not even from base. That might not be true. Jesus. So this is where you really need to ask yourself, what is it that I'm getting out of hitting 5.0 gigahertz and running that all the time? You know, for a while, I just had this magic number in my head that I was like, I need to be at 5.0 gigahertz. But looking at these results, this is exactly the way I've actually been running my computer, mostly because of stability. Now I can run 5.0 gigahertz with XMP on and my GPU overclocked for a very long time, while streaming, while gaming, hours. I could even go days without actually having an issue. The problem is that I'll be streaming one day, and as you guys know, I stream on a single PC, and all of a sudden, blue screen, something crashes. And obviously that's the biggest concern. I don't want to deal with that. Now, for the longest time, I was like, okay, well, I just need to push this thing to the end to get the maximum frames out of this computer. Well, between the findings that I had on running NVENC versus X264 and the benefits there and the FPS gains to be had running NVENC versus being able to run my computer at its stock CPU speeds of 4.7 gigahertz, but maximizing my GPU overclock and running XMP, that seems to be the best of all worlds. My CPU temperatures while gaming are staying roughly in the 50 degrees Celsius range. My CPU stays nice and cool, and I don't have blue screens. I don't have any issues because I'm not pushing the CPU hard. What I am pushing is the GPU, and I spend a lot of time trying to find what's the maximum core speed and what's the maximum memory speed that I could actually push my GPU to. And you have to test that across a lot of different applications. The reality is, it may be great for one game and then all of a sudden it fails in another. To be honest, I was playing Division a lot for a long period of time and I thought I had a stable overclock. I jumped over to Destiny and an hour in, it crashed. So I backed off the core speed and no issues there. So it takes some trial and error, but it is worth it. And when you're looking at GPUs, if you are interested in going this route, again, cooling is the #1 priority. When I was on air cooling, I was thermal throttling my GPU. I was actually not able to push it as hard as I am now. So if this is something that you're interested in, I would heavily look at liquid cooling your GPU. Now, as far as my CPU, my AIO, it was performing roughly almost as well as my custom loop. So that, you've got some options there. But again, my biggest concerns is keeping my CPU temperatures down, keeping my GPU's temperatures down, because that's actually going to keep my core frequency boost up and going to give me the max performance across all games. Now, I know in this video, we looked at a lot of different numbers, a lot of stats. I actually have a lot more stats that I actually captured because I wasn't sure which information was going to be relevant. What parts of this actually told a more interesting story. There is one thing to note that I found interesting, that on Heaven, increasing the CPU overclock, going to 5.0 gigahertz, regardless of the GPU overclock, actually increased my minimum FPS. And on all of the tests where I added my GPU overclock, that actually increased my maximum FPS. So there were some interesting results along the way, but for the most part, I just wanted to get down to the core of which overclock and which settings really mean the most and where you should spend your time, especially if you're talking about going from something like 4.7 to 5.0 on a 99900K. If you're looking at 0.3 gigahertz, the reality is it doesn't make a difference in gaming. So my recommendation would be err on the side of temperature and stability. Push your GPU as far as it can, enable your XMP, and run with that. I hope everybody found this information really helpful. I mean, I always thought this was true. I've actually been running 4.7 gigahertz for a while now, ever since I would get random blue screens after being stable for a while with 5.0. I left my GPU overclock on, and I just noticed after a while, I was hitting the numbers that I was hitting previously. So these are pretty close to the results that I expected. But it's really great to see the validation there. And again, after 12 hours of benchmarks and testing, running every test 3 times, I have quite a bit of data to validate this again. So I feel pretty confident about this. If you guys have any questions or comments, please leave it in the comment section down below. And if you do enjoy this content and you want to see more of these types of breakdowns, like and subscribe. It's the biggest way to support the channel. I really enjoy diving into these kinds of tests that put numbers behind some of the conversations that we have every day about what's the best way to kind of go about running your computer. I plan on doing more of these types of breakdowns in the future, and I hope you enjoy them. So I will see you on the next one.